Every time you sell a great company because the price dropped, you are not managing risk. You are transferring your future wealth to someone with a longer time horizon than yours. I want to sit with that for a moment before we go anywhere else, because I think it deserves to be heard without the rush to qualify it or soften it or immediately surround it with exceptions. Every time, not most times, not in certain circumstances. Every time you sell something genuinely extraordinary because the price made you uncomfortable, someone is on the other side of that transaction. And that someone, the institution, the long horizon fund, the patient private investor who did the research and knows exactly what they own, is not afraid. They are not panicking. They are not reading the same headlines you are and arriving at the same conclusion. They are watching your discomfort create their opportunity. They are grateful for your exit in a way that should be, frankly, a little unsettling to consider. And I want to be precise about something here, because I said this is not a judgment and I meant it. This is a description of a transaction. When you sell a great company in a moment of fear or impatience or the simple exhaustion of watching something you own go down in price, the mechanics of what happens next are straightforward. Your shares transfer to a buyer. That buyer has, by definition, a thesis about this company that extends beyond your current holding period. They are willing to own what you are not willing to own, at the price you are not willing to hold. And from that moment forward, every dollar of appreciation in that company's future belongs to them, not to you. The irony, and it's a heavy irony, one that I've watched cost people enormous amounts of wealth over many years of thinking about this, is not that you fail to profit from the company. It's that you actively hand your profit to the person who was willing to hold what you were unwilling to hold. The company didn't fail you. Your relationship with time failed you. Now I want to take that opening idea and build something real with it, something you can actually use. Because the concept of buy and hold is one of the most cited and least practiced principles in all of investing. Everybody knows it. Everybody agrees it sounds right. Everybody nods when Buffett or Munger says something about holding quality forever, and then almost everybody proceeds to do something else entirely. Not because they're irrational or uninformed or lacking in intelligence or discipline in any simple way, but because the advice buy great companies and hold them forever is handed to people as a conclusion without the underlying architecture that would make that conclusion livable. Without the psychological framework, the practical structure, the emotional tools that would let a real human being with a real nervous system actually sustain that approach across the full, turbulent, disorienting arc of a great company's growth curve. That is what I want to build with you today. Not the slogan, the architecture behind the slogan, the thing that makes buy and hold not just intellectually defensible, but psychologically sustainable across years and decades. And I want to start not with principles, but with pictures, because I've found that the deepest truths land differently when they have a shape you can hold in your mind, when they're not just an idea, but something you can see. The first picture is this. I want you to imagine an oak tree that was planted 40 years ago in the corner of a field. It's a substantial tree now, unmistakably alive, unmistakably growing, root system reaching deep into the earth in ways you can't see from the surface. And at the edge of that field, there is a weather station, a meticulous, sophisticated weather station that has been recording data every single day for those same 40 years. Temperature and rainfall and wind speed and humidity and UV index and barometric pressure, thousands of individual data points, a complete and comprehensive record of every condition that tree has had to endure across 4 decades. Now, here is what I want you to notice about the relationship between that weather station and that tree. In certain years, the weather station recorded data that looked genuinely alarming. A drought in the 3rd year that dropped rainfall to a fraction of normal. An ice storm in the 9th year that stripped the canopy and left the tree looking, to anyone passing by on that particular February morning, like something that might not survive. A fungal outbreak in the 17th year that created visible damage and real uncertainty. And if you had been reading the weather station's output during any of those periods, really reading it daily, with your full attention and your nervous system fully engaged with what the data was saying, you might have concluded that the tree was in trouble, that the conditions were bad enough to warrant concern, that a responsible person in relationship with this tree would do something about the situation. But the tree did not read the weather station. The tree did not evaluate the quarterly precipitation report and decide whether to continue growing. The tree did not receive the wind speed data and pause its growth pending further analysis. The tree just grew, slowly, structurally, according to its own nature and its own deep root system, indifferent to whether any given season looked good on paper. The conditions that the weather station recorded as disasters were, from the tree's perspective, simply conditions. Things that happened and were responded to and were survived and eventually led to the next season of growth. Now, I want you to bring this picture into your investing life, because the parallel is exact and it matters enormously. The investor who plants a great company and then reads the weather station obsessively, who monitors the quarterly reports as if they're determining whether the tree will survive this season, who reacts to every frost as if it changes the fundamental nature and trajectory of what's growing, who sees a bad annual report and starts to question whether the roots are still there, is confusing the measurement of conditions with the reality of the organism. The weather station is real. The data is real. The conditions it records are real, but none of that data determines whether the tree will be standing in 30 more years. Only the tree's nature determines that. And if you planted the right tree, in the right soil, your job is not to manage the weather. Your job is to have enough confidence in what you planted to let it grow through the seasons it will inevitably face. The second picture asks more of you. I want you to imagine two investors who buy the same company in the same year. This is not a hypothetical designed to make one of them look obviously foolish. Both of them have done serious, careful research. Both genuinely understand the business. Both believe, from a place of real analysis, that this company has an exceptional future ahead of it. They begin at the same starting point with the same asset and the same thesis. What separates them is not what they know. It is how they relate to time. The first investor is thoughtful and diligent and genuinely serious. He monitors his position carefully. Monthly portfolio reviews, quarterly earnings calls that he listens to attentively, taking notes, tracking whether management statements align with the financial results. He has a system for evaluating whether the thesis remains intact, a process for asking whether each new development changes his picture of the company's future. And when the price drops meaningfully, he asks serious questions. Is this telling me something? Is this the beginning of something structural? Is the market seeing something I'm not? He is, by almost any conventional measure, doing exactly what a responsible, engaged, serious investor is supposed to do. And over 40 years, he trades the position 19 times. Always for a reason, always with a rationale, always in genuine response to something that felt real in the moment. The second investor does something that looks, from the outside, less sophisticated. She buys the same company, goes home, writes her thesis in a notebook, a clear, specific, plain language description of what the company does that is genuinely valuable. What would have to be true in 20 years for this to have been a great decision? And what specific business developments would tell her that her thesis was wrong? She puts the notebook in a drawer. She does not watch the price daily. She does not listen to every earnings call. She checks in on the actual business, not the price, the business a few times a year, asking the same basic questions about whether the competitive position is intact, whether management is executing, whether the fundamental thesis she wrote in that notebook still describes reality. Over 40 years, she trades it twice. Once, during a major market crash, she adds significantly to her position because the price has disconnected from the business quality in a way that her business analysis makes obvious. And once about 20 years in, she exits cleanly when something genuinely structural changes in the company's competitive position, not because the price scared her, but because she was wrong about something real and she acknowledges that clearly and moves on. At the end of 40 years, their returns are not comparable. The first investor has done well. He made mostly good decisions. His system served him reasonably, but every one of those 19 trades came with a cost, tax, friction, redeployment risk the compounding he interrupted at each transition. And more subtly, he spent enormous amounts of cognitive and emotional energy managing a position that, had he possessed a different relationship with time and with the distinction between price and business quality, would have required almost none of that energy. The second investor's outcome is not just financially superior, it is experientially superior. She owned a great business for 40 years, she watched it grow, she understood it deeply enough to add when others were panicking and exit cleanly when the real thesis broke. She did not spend 40 years anxious about her holding. She spent 40 years in a genuine relationship with something she understood. The difference between those two investors is not intelligence. It is not access to better information or a superior system or unusual psychological gifts. It is one thing, the willingness and the capacity to separate the story of the price from the story of the business, and to hold the business story as the only one that ultimately determines the outcome. That separation, simple in concept, genuinely demanding in practice, is the whole game. And everything I want to share with you for the rest of this conversation is about how to build the capacity to make that separation real, not just in theory, but in the actual moments when it matters. In the moments when the price is down 30% and the news is bad and your nervous system is generating exit signals with the confidence and urgency of something that knows what it's talking about. In those moments, the separation has to be real. It has to be structural. It cannot be manufactured on the spot from willpower alone. It has to be built in advance, from the right materials, in the right order. Let me give you the first principle, and I want to go slowly here because I think this is the one that carries the most weight and gets the least careful treatment in most investing conversations. Price volatility and business deterioration are not the same thing. That sounds almost too obvious to say. And yet the confusion between these two things is responsible for, I believe, more wealth destruction among individual investors than any other single cause. More than bad stock picks, more than timing errors, more than fees or taxes or any of the other friction that financial content spends so much time discussing. The confusion between price volatility and business deterioration is the primary engine of wealth transfer from long-term investors who know better to patient holders who act on what they know. Let me make this concrete by going to the examples that I think illustrate it most powerfully, because when you see the scale of what this confusion has cost people historically, it becomes very difficult to maintain the casual relationship with selling that most investors carry. Amazon dropped 94% during the dot-com crash. 94%. If you had invested $10,000 in Amazon in 1999 at the height of the bubble, watched it fall to $600 by 2001, and sold at any point during that decline, you did not lose $10,000. You transferred the right to participate in the subsequent 40,000% rise to someone who didn't sell. The actual business of Amazon was not 94% less valuable in 2001 than it was in 1999. The infrastructure being built, the customer relationships being developed, the logistics network being laid, the competitive advantages being assembled, none of those fell 94%. The price fell 94%. The business continued. Apple dropped 75% in the early 2000s, while Steve Jobs was executing one of the most consequential strategic pivots in business history. The investors who sold during that decline were reading the weather station. They were looking at the price data and concluding that the tree was dying. Jobs was building the iPod. Jobs was rebuilding the product line. Jobs was making the decisions that would eventually produce the iPhone and completely transform Apple into the most valuable company in human history. None of that was visible in the price. None of it was reflected in the quarterly results in the short term. The business was getting better in ways that the price, for a period, refused to acknowledge. And the cost of misreading that refusal as information about the business rather than as noise about the market's current emotional state was, for investors who sold generational. Netflix dropped 80% in 2011 and 2012, while transitioning from DVD delivery to streaming, a transition that Reed Hastings understood completely, that the competitive logic demanded entirely and that the market evaluated as catastrophic in the short term. The investors who held through that decline were not reckless. They were doing the thing that the second investor in my parable was doing. They were asking, has the business deteriorated or has the price moved? And their honest assessment was that the business was executing on a thesis that remained intact, even while the price was telling a different story. In every one of these cases, the price said something was broken. The business said something different. And the investors who built generational wealth from these companies were the ones who had done enough work, the right kind of work, the business analysis, rather than the price watching, to know the difference between what the price was saying and what the business was doing. The paradox I want you to hold here is this: the information that matters most to a long-term investor, the quality and trajectory of the underlying business, changes slowly and is entirely readable if you know what to look for. The information that matters least, the daily and weekly movement of the price, arrives constantly and loudly and creates the visceral feeling of urgency that causes most investors to do the wrong thing at the worst possible moment. More price data produces more noise-driven decisions. Better business understanding produces more durable holding, and durable holding is where all the wealth lives. The second principle I want to explore with you is compounding, and I want to go deeper with it than the standard treatment, because I think the standard treatment undersells the most important part of it. Compounding is the closest thing to a financial law of physics that exists in investing. It is not a strategy or a style or an approach you choose from among alternatives. It is what happens to money that is positioned correctly and left alone long enough. And its power is not linear. It does not add value at a steady rate across time. It accelerates. It grows faster in the later years than in the earlier ones, which means the most valuable period of any compounding investment is the period at the end, not the beginning. The years you are most tempted to sell, the years when the early returns feel slow and the opportunity cost of holding feels real, are the years before the acceleration becomes obvious. And the years when the compounding becomes most dramatically visible, when the growth is genuinely astonishing, are the years that are only available to you if you held through all the earlier, less impressive years. I want to give you a specific illustration of this, because the mathematics here is worth feeling, not just knowing. Imagine you invest in a great company that compounds at 10% annually. In the first year, $10,000 becomes $11,000. The gain is $1,000. In year 20, your $10,000 has become approximately $67,000. In year 30, it has become approximately $175,000. The gain between year 20 and year 30, the gain from holding for one additional decade is more than $100,000. The gain from the entire first 20 years was $57,000. That means the last decade of a 30-year holding period is worth more than twice the entire first 20 years combined. And that pattern only accelerates further. The 40th year of compounding at 10% takes your $10,000 to approximately $450,000. The gain between year 30 and year 40 is nearly 3 times the gain of the entire first 30 years. What this means in practice is devastating in its simplicity. Every time you sell a compounding asset and reset the clock, you are giving up the most valuable part of the investment. Not the early part, the late part. The part where the numbers stop looking incremental and start looking extraordinary. The investor who holds for 30 years owns the last decade of that 30-year compounding curve. The investor who sells at 15 and reboughts at 16 owns a new 15-year curve that will never reach the heights of the original, even if the re-entry price is marginally better, even if the tax is managed cleverly, even if every individual decision along the way was defensible. The aggregate cost of the interrupted compounding is almost always greater than any of the individual benefits that were used to justify the interruption. There is also something else happening every time you sell a compounding position that most investors underestimate almost completely, and it is the tax event and the redeployment problem. When you sell in a taxable account, you owe taxes on your gains. That tax payment does not compound. It leaves the system entirely. And then you have to find something to do with the remaining capital, something that is as good as or better than what you sold at a price that isn't artificially elevated by the same optimism that made you want to take profits. The probability of successfully executing that redeployment consistently across many years and many cycles in a way that outperforms simply holding the original position is low. Not impossible occasionally, it is clearly the right move, but low enough and consistently enough that the default assumption should be that the interruption will cost you more than it saves you. The third principle is the one that I think requires the most careful language, because it is easy to state in a way that sounds like I'm recommending you ignore new information, and I am absolutely not recommending that. The thesis, not the price, is the proper object of ongoing evaluation. What I mean by this is specific and important. The business thesis you built before you bought the reasoned, structured understanding of why this company is worth owning across a long period, what it does that is genuinely valuable, what makes its competitive position durable, what the management team is capable of, what the financial health looks like. That thesis is what you should be evaluating continuously, not the price, not relative to the price, not in terms of whether the price is confirming or denying your thesis. The business against the thesis. Nothing else. Price is an opinion. It is the aggregated, capital-weighted opinion of every market participant at a given moment. And those market participants include institutional traders with quarterly mandates, algorithms responding to momentum signals, individual investors reacting to headlines, fund managers managing their own career risk rather than their clients' long-term returns, and countless others whose time horizon and objectives have nothing to do with the long-term value of the underlying business. The price reflects all of that simultaneously. It is real, it determines what you can buy and sell for, and ignoring it entirely would be its own kind of mistake, but it is not the truth about the business. The truth about the business lives somewhere completely different in the quality of the products and the loyalty of the customers and the wisdom of the capital allocation and the depth of the competitive moat and the trajectory of the unit economics. These things do not update every minute. They update across quarters and years, and they require a kind of attention that is fundamentally different from chart watching. The investor who has built a real separation between these two objects of evaluation, who looks at a 30% price decline and asks, first, has something changed in the business, before asking, what does this price mean for me, is the investor who can hold extraordinary companies across extraordinary periods of time. Not because they feel nothing about the price decline, feeling something is human and entirely appropriate, but because their feeling does not determine their action. Their action is determined by the business analysis, which has its own answer that exists independently of the price movement. And here is the fourth principle, the one that I find most practically powerful and most consistently underused. The exit must carry a higher burden of proof than the hold. In most investors' psychological frameworks, the default is to sell when something feels uncomfortable. Holding is treated as the passive option, the thing you do when you haven't yet made a decision. Selling is treated as the active option, the expression of judgment, the evidence of thoughtfulness, the doing of something in response to new information. And this framing, while entirely natural, is exactly backwards for a long-term investor in a great business. If you hold something genuinely great, holding should be the default. Holding is the thing that is working. Holding is the thing that is generating the compounding. Selling should require a burden of proof that is significantly higher than the discomfort of volatility. The question should never be, do I have a reason to continue holding? It should be, do I have a reason to interrupt the compounding? Has something changed in the actual business, not the price, not the sentiment, not the sector rotation, not the macro environment, but the actual business that would make my original thesis genuinely wrong? If the answer is no, then selling is not a decision, it is a reaction. And reactions in long-term investing are almost always expensive. This inversion requires you to carry the burden of proof in the right direction. when you feel the impulse to sell. The question is not, is there a reason to stay? It is, has something real enough changed to justify interrupting something that was working? That is a harder case to make. And it should be a harder case to make, because the cost of an unnecessary exit, when compounding is at work across decades, is not a small number. It is a very large number that will not be visible for years, which is exactly why it is so easy to dismiss in the moment. Now, let me give you the 3 practices that make all of this real. Not aspirational, not theoretical, real in your actual account, in your actual decision-making, in the moments that actually matter. The first practice is this: write the thesis before you buy and date it. Before you purchase any company you intend to hold long-term, before you execute the trade, before you own a single share, take 30 minutes and write down your thesis in plain language. What does this company do that is genuinely valuable and genuinely defensible? What would have to be true in 10 or 15 years for this to have been a great investment decision? What specific business developments, not price levels, actual business developments, would tell you that your thesis was wrong and that an exit is genuinely justified? Write it in your own words, at a level of specificity that you could use as an actual decision framework in a future moment of uncertainty. Give it a date, keep it somewhere you can find it. This document serves one primary purpose. It anchors your future evaluations of new information to the actual structure of your investment rather than to your emotional state at the moment the information arrives. When the stock falls 30% 6 months from now and your nervous system starts generating exit signals, return to this document. Read what you wrote when you were calm and clear and grounded in your analysis. Ask the only question that matters. Has anything in this thesis actually changed? If the business is still doing what you believed it would do, if the competitive position is still intact, if management is still executing with the quality you analyzed, then the price movement is weather. The tree is still growing. You have your answer. The second practice is to separate your portfolio review from your price watching, deliberately and structurally. These are 2 completely different mental activities, and the problem for most investors is that they do the deeper, more important one, the business evaluation, while their nervous system is already activated by the price data they just looked at. You cannot evaluate a business clearly when you are looking at a price that has dropped 23% since last Tuesday. Your analytical capacity is being run in the context of loss aversion, and loss aversion will contaminate every conclusion you reach. The brain that is processing a paper loss is not the same brain that can objectively evaluate whether a competitive moat remains intact. So separate them. Look at prices briefly and infrequently. Once a week is more than enough for a long-term holding, and once a month is entirely reasonable. Do your actual business evaluation on a completely different day at a different time without looking at the current price. Read the annual report. Read the last 2 earnings transcripts. Ask your real questions about the business. Form your conclusions about the thesis. And only then, from that grounded analytical position, check the price and ask whether it presents any new actionable information. You will be genuinely surprised by how different your conclusions are when you arrive at the price from the business rather than arriving at the business from the price. The third practice is to build your sell criteria list before you need it. For each of your core long-term holdings, write down specifically what would have to happen for you to sell. Not a price target, not a percentage decline threshold. A business development, the loss of a key competitive advantage to a superior competitor. A management team whose capital allocation decisions have consistently and demonstrably destroyed value over 3 or more years. A fundamental regulatory change that makes the original business model economically unviable. A structural shift in the industry, genuinely structural, not cyclical, that makes the core thesis obsolete. A discovery of fraud or significant ethical failure in the management of the business. Write this list before a crisis, because the middle of a crisis is the worst possible time to construct your criteria. When a crisis arrives, your nervous system will be happy to provide you with a sell criteria list, but it will not be the right list. It will be the list that removes the pain of the current situation, which is not the same as the list that serves your actual long-term interests. Having the criteria written in advance in your own handwriting, from your own clear thinking, from a place of non-emergency analysis, is what allows you to meet a difficult moment with real information rather than reactive fear. And it does something else that I think is genuinely underappreciated. It makes holding far easier because you know that if the real reasons to sell appear the ones you wrote down when you were thinking clearly, you will see them. You have defined them. You are watching for them. And when what arrives instead is a bad quarter, a sector rotation, a geopolitical scare, an analyst downgrade, you can name it for what it is. Weather. The weather station doing its job, the tree continuing to grow. Let me bring this home. Let me bring together everything we've covered and leave you with something that holds its shape. We started with a disruption, that every sale of a great company in a moment of fear is a transfer of future wealth to someone with a longer time horizon, not a risk management decision, a wealth transfer. That framing is not designed to make you feel bad about past decisions. It is designed to change the emotional weight of future ones, to make the cost of unnecessary exits feel as real as the benefit of avoiding unnecessary losses. We looked at the oak tree that grows through every season, the weather station records as a disaster. We looked at two investors who owned the same company for 40 years and arrived at completely different destinations, not because of different information or different intelligence, but because of a different relationship with the distinction between price and business. One investor confused the two, and the confusion cost him decades of compounding. The other separated them, and the separation was worth everything. We built the case for four principles: that price, volatility, and business deterioration are not the same thing, and confusing them is catastrophically expensive. That compounding requires duration, and every exit resets the clock in ways that the ordinary cost-benefit analysis of selling almost always fails to capture. That the thesis is the proper object of evaluation, not the price, and that evaluating the business from the price rather than the price from the business is one of the most common and most expensive analytical mistakes individual investors make. And that the exit must carry a higher burden of proof than the hold, because selling is not the responsible response to volatility. In a great business, selling is the expensive one. You are not wrong for wanting to act when a great company drops in price. You are human. The pull toward action in the face of a loss is one of the most fundamental responses your nervous system knows how to generate. It served your ancestors extraordinarily well in environments where threats were physical and immediate and required a fast response. It serves you extraordinarily poorly in an environment where the most important thing you can do is wait. You don't need to be braver. You need to be clearer. You don't need to feel less. You need to look at the right thing. The great company doesn't need you to watch it every day. It needs you to understand it deeply enough to leave it alone when the weather turns cold, to know the difference between a frost and a death, to be the person who planted the acorn and had the patience to let 40 years of seasons do the work that no amount of daily monitoring could have done better. That is not passive. That is not easy. That is not the absence of discipline. It is the highest expression of it. Holding something great through everything the market will throw at it across decades of real human life is the most demanding thing a long-term investor ever does, and it is worth every bit of what it costs. If something in this landed, if the oak tree stayed with you, if the two-investor parable shifted something, if one of the principles gave language to a decision you made in the past that you're still sitting with, or a decision you're in the middle of right now, leave it in the comments. Tell me what it was. Tell me where it connected. That is the conversation I am here to have, and it matters to me to know what actually reaches people. A like helps this reach the investor who is sitting with a great company right now in a difficult week, trying to decide whether what they're feeling is information or noise. They need this. Maybe you were that person when you clicked play. Maybe you still are. That's okay. The clarity is available. It just requires the right starting point. And if you want to keep building this foundation, the business understanding, the psychological architecture, the structural practices that make great long-term investing actually survivable in real life, not just in theory. Subscribe. One honest, unhurried conversation at a time. The great companies don't need you to manage them. They need you to believe in them long enough, clearly enough, deeply enough for that belief to become wealth. Not because belief alone is sufficient, you have to do the real work of understanding what you own, but because without the belief, without the conviction that survives the weather, even the best analysis in the world will be abandoned at the moment it matters most. The tree is growing. Let it grow.